Welcome to the 5th episode of the AfterSessions. Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess.
Imagine velvet curtains heavy with dust, stone walls luminous with trembling candlelights, elegant drapes and luxurious furniture adorned it. A Hungarian countryside castle that hid more than it revealed. This was not just a home, it was a Gothic kingdom of blood and fear.
Girls were sent there to serve, to clean, and to learn manners. They passed through the towering iron gates to never be seen again. They vanished into thin air, one by one, dozens, then hundreds. By the time the whispers turned into shouts, nearly 600 girls had disappeared, swallowed by stone and secrecy.
The castle seemed to breathe. Servants claimed the walls echoed with screams. Corridors shrieked even when no one was there. Every shadow was clouded with fear. Every locked door hid cold-blooded bodies. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, a noble woman remembered as history's most infamous countess.
In 1560, Elizabeth Báthory was born into the powerful and eccentric Báthory family that controlled Transylvania. But Báthory's privileged upbringing was tainted by violence and health problems. Already at the age of 4 or 5, she suffered from epileptic seizures, violent mood swings, and painful migraines.
From a psychological point of view, the grandiosity and entitlement of her environment may have distorted empathy, leading to narcissistic personality disorder or NPD, a condition where the brain stops seeing others as real people, making you self-centered and antisocial. At the same time, her medical struggles might have led to neurological dysregulation, which can highly affect impulse control, emotional stability, and emotional development.
Báthory was also exposed to brutality. Servants were routinely beaten in this era. At age 6, she watched a public execution. The exposure to trauma at a young age possibly led to desensitization to suffering. At 13, Báthory was engaged to the 18-year-old Count Ferenc Nadasdy of another influential Hungarian family, and they married 2 years later. They eventually had 4 children.
As newlyweds, they moved to Shavar in western Hungary, where Nadasdy schooled his wife in torture. Nadasdy Castle became the site of several atrocities. For Báthory's pleasure, Nadasdy had a girl restrained, lathered in honey, and ravaged by insects. He also gifted the Countess gloves spiked by claws with which to thrash her servants for their mistakes. This enforced the social learning theory, which states that people learn behavior by watching powerful role models, as might have been in the case of Elizabeth.
Báthory's Aunt Clara also introduced her to orgies and a shadowy circle of people considered sorcerers, witches, and alchemists. Elizabeth seemed to have become obsessed with the black arts, and she surrounded herself with witches, who served as her familiars in her sadistic sexual games. This possibly led to moral disengagement, a psychological process defined by Albert Bandura, where individuals convince themselves that ethical standards do not apply to them in a particular context, allowing them to engage in harmful or unethical behavior without experiencing guilt or distress.
When Báthory moved to the Nadasdy Palace in Vienna, the rumors changed in tone. Monks across the street complained of screams at night. Neighbors spoke of blood in the drains. Whether every detail was accurate matters less than what followed, because by this point, multiple servant girls were already disappearing from her household.
Historical records show that young female servants were subjected to escalating punishment, beatings, prolonged confinement, and severe discipline that went far beyond social norms of the time. What stands out isn't just violence, it's domination. The repeated use of suffering as a method of control.
Psychologically, this aligns with power-based aggression, where harm isn't impulsive but deliberate. According to social psychologists Jim Sedanius and Felicia Prato, who proposed the social dominance theory, wherein individuals at the top of rigid hierarchies can begin to view subordinates as objects rather than people, tools to assert status rather than lives with boundaries.
As disputes accumulated, so did the severity. The violence escalated. More victims, harsher methods. This follows a known psychological pattern, desensitization. When an individual faces no consequences, stimulation loses impact. More extreme behavior is needed to achieve the same sense of control.
This isn't clinical psychosis. There is no evidence of hallucinations or loss of reality. Instead, it reflects entitlement-driven cruelty, often linked to traits seen in psychopathy and malignant narcissism, lack of empathy, grandiosity, and the belief that rules apply only to others.
So the question isn't why did she lose control? It's why was she allowed to keep it for so long? When power removes accountability, does cruelty become inevitable or merely easier? Because in environments where servants are disposable and authority is absolute, violence doesn't need madness to grow. It needs permission.
Then came the Countess's final undoing, the replacement of the servant girls with girls from higher noble class families. The mysterious disappearance of noble women was far more noticeable. The Lutheran pastor at Jete clashed with the Countess over the burial of so many young girls, and left his successor a report of his suspicions.
The second pastor too questioned the number of burials, and he uncovered petrifying bodies of young girls in a vault beneath his church. Because of the pastor's suspicions, Báthory, ostensibly pious, abandoned giving her victims Christian burials. Disposing of the bodies now became an acute problem, and his servants grew careless.
Finally, in 1610, an investigation began into dozens of suspicious deaths and disappearances in Shakite, launched by Matthias II, King of Hungary. On December 29, accompanied by Báthory's sons-in-laws, Miklos and Yash, along with Báthory's nemesis Imre, and Turzo, who was Báthory's kinman, took a company of armed retainers to Shete.
When investigators finally stepped inside Elizabeth Báthory's estates, they didn't find a single dramatic confession. They found accounts, dozens of them. Witnesses testified to abuse and unexplained deaths within their households. Girls who entered service and never returned. Bodies buried quietly, injuries dismissed as discipline.
Because many of these accounts came from servants, people with no title, no protection, no power, their words were filtered through fear. Fear of their mistress, fear of authorities, fear of saying the wrong thing. So we have to ask, were these testimonies acts of courage or survival? And when someone finally has permission to speak, do they tell only what they saw or everything they've ever suspected?
Some witnesses claimed to have seen direct violence. Others admitted they were repeating what they'd heard from someone else, and that matters. In early modern Europe, rumors spread fast, especially around a powerful woman who already stood apart.
One account came from Reverend Istvan Ponikinas, a Lutheran minister who served near Báthory's estates. In his testimony, he stated that he had been repeatedly asked to conduct burials for young women who had died while in Countess's service. At first, he was told the deaths were due to illnesses. Over time, the number of burials increased, enough that he began to question the explanations he was never given.
What makes his account notable is that Ponikinas wasn't a servant inside the castle. He had no reason to invent stories for protection. His role was administrative, almost routine, until the routine itself became unsettling. So the question becomes, how many unexplained deaths does it take before suspicion replaces assumption?
On its own, his testimony proves nothing, but placed alongside dozens of similar statements about disappearances, injuries, and sudden deaths, it becomes part of a larger pattern investigations could no longer ignore.
Over time, Elizabeth Báthory stopped being a person and became folklore, a monster shaped by repetition. Blood Countess, vampire, her name hardened into something easier to fear than understand.
In that form, she became a symbol of unchecked power. Authority without oversight, wealth without consequence. A system that protected status long before it questioned harm. And that transformation matters. When history turns women into villains, complexity disappears. The individual absorbs the blame, while the structures that enabled them quietly vanish.
Psychologically, this is how stories survive. Simplification makes memory sticky. Monsters are easier to remember than systems. But if we stop at the monster, we miss the warning. Power doesn't corrupt in isolation. It's sustained by silence, fear, and permission.
Elizabeth Báthory's stories exist in the uneasy space between record and rumor. It became hard to distinguish between what was proven in court and what grew darker with every retelling. History never fully agrees on where truth ends and myth begins. Whether she was a sadistic killer or a woman consumed by accusation, the truth remains unsettling. Hundreds of voices were lost and none were ever fully heard.
Beneath the blood-soaked stories is a quieter warning. When power is sealed off from scrutiny, cruelty is prevalent. Labeling her as a bloodthirsty monster is unfair. Castles don't make monsters, isolation does. Authority doesn't corrupt overnight, it decays slowly, behind closed doors.
Her legacy forces us to confront how easily suffering disappears when it belongs to the powerless. The girls who entered her castle were remembered only through numbers. This is the real horror, not just what may have happened behind stone walls, but how quietly the world allowed it to continue. Because history remembers power loudly and pain in whispers.